I thought you had a really, really cool background, by the way. And when I saw that, I'm like, you're going to be a great guy to check in with. So I was actually just curious about, your trek from Harvard, all the way to where, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Harvard and all the really interesting research that you've been doing since then. Like, how did you end up getting on the track around the psychology of things? Like, you started doing work then about ego development. How did you ever get started? Like, what got you on that track?
Um, so I think there must have been some crucial formative experience as a child because I was always interested in meditation, even as like a young child. And I got into martial arts when I was a kid too. And a big portion of martial arts is the mental side of training. So your focus determines your success. And that probably turned me on to the idea that this thing in between our ears is pretty powerful and has a lot of potential. So even through high school, I started to think about meditation a lot and started to study some different practices. And in my undergraduate degree, I studied cognitive science, which is like this nice combination of psychology, philosophy, computer science, linguistics, anthropology, and it's at its core, it's the study of how systems work. So the system of a culture, or the system of a machine, or the system of an individual. And afterwards, or actually while I was at UConn, I started working for this company called the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine, which is kind of a mouthful. But what they do is they interview meditation experts, they interview clinical psychologists, they interview different researchers to understand different trends in well-being and how we can translate those to clinical interventions. So I got some exposure to some research while I was there. And then after UConn, I moved to Boston and started to work in a few different research labs. One research lab was studying the impact of yoga and meditation on the brain. So we were using fMRI scanners to understand the impact of an 8-week meditation course on the brain. And at the other one, we were studying invasive brain-machine interface technology. So something called a deep brain stimulation device for people with Parkinson's disease. So I had this kind of combination of brain-machine interface technology and some neuroscience research on meditation and yoga. And my next step was going to Harvard and studying human development and psychology. I got really interested in leadership development. So what are the psychological changes, the ego development that people go throughout their adulthood, and how does that relate to being an effective leader? And when I graduated from Harvard, I was planning on going into leadership development and got a couple job offers in that space. And then I got this job offer from this crazy sounding startup called Brainco. There was only like 15 people in the company. And I wasn't really sure about it, to be honest. But I met the CEO, who's an incredibly ambitious person. And I saw his vision. And so I joined them about 3.5 years ago. And now we went from like 15 people, and now we're close to 200 people with offices in the US and China.
It's beautiful, and I really, really love what you're doing. And really, your background is just phenomenal, and they could not have. So your position at Brainco is what right now?
So I'm president for Brainco USA.
Okay, so I don't think they could have picked a more perfect person with the background that you have, and it's really interesting. So you have several different products. I was wondering if you could just kind of navigate through what each of these are. Some of them have apps. There's even sort of products for students. So where did you kind of start from? What was the MVP that started this all?
Right. So the MVP was a wearable device that detects your brain activity. So for people in the neuroscience space, we're using EEG technology. And we've developed a few key innovations around how we acquire that signal and how we analyze that signal. And then we can apply it in some unique ways. So the start of it was this EEG device. But Brainco's products fall into two major categories. One is smart prosthetics for amputees, and one is this wearable device and all the applications that we have for it. So these are the two main things that we do.
Perfect. So can you actually dissect the prosthetics piece? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So like I said, the MVP was the headband, and we were at a conference, and we had a demo of this little plastic hand that would open and close based on your focus or your relaxation. It would actuate the hand. And an amputee came over who had this smart prosthetic hand, and he was asking if we could make some device for him where he could control his prosthetic with his brain. And so we started to talk with him a little bit more, and we found out that the prosthetic he had was $70,000. And so a very small percentage of amputees can get a prosthetic like this. So we started to tinker around with the idea of using our headband to control a prosthetic, but it's really not all that reliable using EEG signal to control a prosthetic. Primarily what's used are EMG signals, so the muscle signals coming from the residual limb. So if my amputation is below my elbow, the sensors lay on the part of my arm that's left, and then depending on those muscle movements, it will control the prosthetic. And we started to think about how we could lower the cost. So we've constructed a mechanical design that allows us to lower the cost a lot. But really the key innovation is in the algorithm. We're coming out with a product that will be approved by the FDA by the end of this year that gives users really precise control. So instead of using your muscles kind of like a switch to activate different gestures, we have a training program where we'll ask the amputee to think about making a fist, or think about pointing a finger, or think about, doing a key grip or something. And after about 30 minutes of training, our deep learning algorithm has taken enough signals from the user so that they can control individual fingers just like you or I do. So the innovation here is really on the deep learning side and how we're able to apply that to provide a really low cost prosthetic for amputees.
There's going to be a lot of people listening to this from the pharma and medical device space. Mm-hmm. Have you partnered, so how does the funding work here in the development? Who are you partnering with, and how, when you've gone through the FDA, is this considered a digital therapeutic, or, tell us a little bit about how that all kind of worked out.
Sure. So we're VC funded. And for the FDA, there are some predicate devices. So there are some really great prosthetics out there already. The control mechanism, though, typically works more like a switch rather than an intuitive connection between the user and the prosthetic. So the way that the FDA submission works on a really high level is you can point towards these predicate devices and say, hey, these are already approved. This is why they're safe. They passed all these ISO standards, testing, and we have done that too. The differentiation is on the software side, and this is how our software works. This is why our software is safe. So, from our understanding and the FDA consultants that we're working with and our other advisors that we're working with, we don't see a huge hurdle in getting FDA approval.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely see some people seeing this as an extension of other things that they're working on, potentially, several different kinds of healthcare opportunities, I think, in that space.
Yeah.
And as it relates to like the future, artificial intelligence, the world of virtual reality, I think now, especially in, post COVID-19, have you started thinking about other applications for this prosthetic hand?
So
in terms of the concept of haptics and, feeling things aren't really there, and what can we do with this?
Right. So we have been approached by a few different potential partners that are interested in lifelike hands. So things like testing products or different types of assembly procedures, or anything where a human hand might be of value. There's a potential for us to use this type of technology there, or because our algorithm can understand the user's intention so well, you could even think of like a cuff, like a bracelet that's used for someone who's not an amputee, but as an interface with different technology. So, as you're doing these subtle movements that you've trained the cuff or the bracelet to understand, it's interacting with the things around you. So that would be maybe a more like general application of the technology.
Yeah, very interesting.
Haptics, some people working on that too. So how can you feed back the information that the prosthetic is getting into the user. So that's certainly something that people are already exploring.
Yeah, I mean, here's another thing as well too. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about people talking about their personal avatar,
Yeah.
and eventually looking at mechanisms or kind of robotic parts like this that become the extension of your virtual avatar.
Right.
We're kind of getting futuristic on it, but
yeah, my perspective on this it has always been look to the future, and then rely on what's possible now, because there's a balance to be had. You want to have this big vision. It gets energy moving. It gets people moving in the right direction, but it's important to kind of be grounded in what we can do now so that we can over deliver on what's actually possible. But it's certainly, if you look at the type of applications of this technology or related technology for people who are paralyzed and they have full body exoskeletons where they're able to walk again, right? It's simple, or it's not simple. It's not like these people are doing backflips, but you can really clearly see the trend of where this is going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of quality of life and so many other elements. Kind of want to backtrack onto the MVP, which is, here in Toronto, as you probably have heard of the company Muse, and everything that's going on with their headband. Tell us a little bit about your headband. Does it run on a different technology, a different algorithm? How is it the same? How is it different than Muse?
Sure. So the first generation of our hardware is called Focus One. And some of the differentiators between how we apply this technology and how Muse applies this technology, which, by the way, is a really great company. I really love their hardware. I think they're doing awesome work. The sensors that we're using, so we developed this material, this proprietary material that's considered, or is what's called a hydrogel electrode. So we can get a really, really high quality raw EEG signal from this type of sensor. So our research partners that we're working with really love using this if they want to look at the raw EEG signal, so all the data that the headband's capturing. The other differentiator is for the first generation product, we're using Wi-Fi, which allows us to collect data from 100 users at once in a given room. So imagine you're in a lecture hall. You could have 100 people wearing this headband and all that data streaming to one person's computer, either for a research study or to understand engagement during learning, which is some research that we've done. And then the third differentiator is in the algorithm. So we've created our own machine learning algorithm to quantify different cognitive states like engagement and relaxation. And we're working on some other algorithms too.
Right. So this is really, really essential stuff in a myriad of different ways. And I think as many scientists like you and I and many others who are sort of demystifying the kind of the spirituality behind machines and behind science, it's a very interesting bridge. Yeah. And I'm just curious as to what has the uptake been, and have you noticed anything pre or post COVID in terms of the adoption, awareness, or receptivity to not only the hardware, but the apps, the software, and kind of the so what?
Yeah, definitely. So there's two main things that come to mind. One is remote learning. So in a remote learning situation, if you could understand how to create a more engaging environment for the people learning by using what's happening in their mind to augment or modify what's being displayed on the screen, you can create a much more engaging environment. So we've done some studies with MIT Media Lab where with a very simple type of feedback, they were able to improve test scores, improve how engaged someone's brain was, and improve how engaged people felt during learning. So by using this type of data, you can create more engaging learning experiences. So that would be one, if remote learning continues to, this trend kind of continues, I think there's some really interesting applications there. And in fact, we're working with a really large partner on implementing something like that. The second piece, I think, is this trend that we're noticing of people becoming more and more aware of how important their cognitive well-being is, right? And I think COVID-19 spiked a lot of anxiety in a lot of people, rightfully so. So we're thinking about how can we apply this technology to help people gain more control over their cognitive well-being, improve their certain wellness outcomes. And we've been studying this in a few different populations, but we think that it's time to open this up to a broader population. And I think that the events over the past few weeks have made people realize how important it is to take care of ourselves. And so if we can provide them with a tool that allows them to achieve these types of outcomes, especially in a fun and engaging way, which is what we're designing right now, I think it's going to be, it's almost like a fun game you get to play, but the outcome is you're more calm, you're more relaxed, and you're more in control.
And this is a really important, I mean, obviously this, pandemics and future pandemics to come, we're hearing a lot of information that there's an increase in some of these mental or undiagnosed or hidden mental health issues. People are going to be retrieving this information almost like a PTSD type of thing. And so there's no better time, I think, for these kinds of technologies. Now, what is the rigor around controlled studies, FDA approvals? Is this something that can be considered an actual digital therapeutic where somebody can go into a digital pharmacy and prescribe your product and or app to help with PTSD, anxiety, depression?
Right. So our product is not a medical device, and it doesn't treat or diagnose any medical condition. It's what's considered a general wellness device, is what the guidance that the FDA has provided. And what I would say to people in this space or who are considering this space is there's advantages to both sides of the coin. If you have FDA approval, then of course there's a business model to be had with insurance providers and different healthcare providers. The trade-off is, of course, the amount of studies and the investment you need to put into to do those studies and the time it takes. And on the flip side, if you're not targeting a medical condition and you're just more of a general wellness product, then the regulations around what you can say are very clear, right? You can't claim that you're treating any medical condition, but then on the other side, you don't have to go through that, multi-year long process. So our perspective on this is we're going to stick to something that's more of a general wellness product and help people feel better, help people, reduce their stress. And if down the road we're starting to see more and more of a specific clinical population that's gravitating towards this, then we'll consider the time and investment necessary to put that through a full FDA approval process. The direction that I'm seeing is that will certainly happen over the next 5 to 10 years. I think these technologies will start to shift into more of a medical application. And we're seeing that, we've already seen that with things like TDCS and TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation being approved to treat things like depression. And I can see this type of technology also moving in that direction. But from an entrepreneurial point of view, there's advantages to both sides.
Right, absolutely. And there's pros and cons, and there's timing and specifics, and it all costs money. So talking about that, as we know, there's obviously been traditional players in the healthcare space, big pharma, small pharma, biotech, medical device companies. As they're sort of looking at their business models, and there's kind of a lot of evolution in what's going on. And I think this recent pandemic is getting a lot of people to do some real inner reflection. Mm-hmm. Is how would pharma look at companies like yourselves or as partners like yourselves, or what's possible for changing the beyond the pill thinking, getting into devices and providing therapeutics that are of completely different caliber? What would you say to them?
Yeah. So there's a couple components. One component is on the assessment side. So can these technologies be used to assess different types of neurologically based conditions? Can we use this technology to assess stress? Maybe even putting treatment on the side for a second, just to assess these mental conditions. And is that of value to those types of companies? And then on the treatment side, what I think and what I've seen is that there are pharmaceutical companies that are starting to enter this space. Either the ones that I've actually seen are by investing in companies like ours. So, if I was running a pharmaceutical company and my business is good and I see this potential emerging technology, right, it would make sense to explore it, do my due diligence, try to validate it, and then either do something on my own or invest in those types of companies. So I think the smart play is collaboration and partnerships. And I imagine we'll start seeing more and more of those as the clinical data comes out. If you're thinking about working with a pharmaceutical company, then of course it makes sense that you're going to be taking more of the FDA route and needing a high level of clinical significance to partner with those types of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually brings up some really interesting questions, because as we start talking about making these things more visible, have larger play and utility, there's a data piece to this. Let's be honest, that data is the new oil. It's the new fuel of our economy. And we're running into a lot of old infrastructure and legacy regulations, and then a whole other bioethics concern around privacy and what is ownership of data. Right. What are some of the things that you're doing on these topics?
I am so impressed with how our team has taken a stance on data privacy and security and data ethics. So we work with a number of outside organizations and have an internal data privacy and security team that's really taking a look at how do we be best in class at this. And there's some really obvious reasons, which are, of course, it's our duty to protect people's data. And then the other thing that's interesting that I've seen some other people talk about, which I tend to agree with, is there's a level of optics on data privacy and security. So if I dig into that just a little bit, what I mean is when people see a headband like ours, they immediately go, oh my God, that's going to read my mind. That can read my thoughts, which isn't true. You can't use this technology that we have right now to diagnose anything, to identify emotions, to even identify who you are, right? I could look at all of your EEG data in the world and have no idea who you were just based on that. In some ways, your birth date and email are more sensitive than some of the biometric data that people are collecting. But the feeling is that it's really personal, which makes 100% sense because you're wearing this technology. So another layer of this is how do we make sure people feel comfortable with trying something new, right? It's a new technology. So making the environment feel as safe as possible with really being a leader in terms of data privacy and security is our take on this. So while the data might not be more sensitive than your social security number, the same level of the same level of best practices apply to kind of whatever data you're collecting, especially as we see new regulations like GDPR and CCPA, and staying on top of those so that our users and our partners know that we take this seriously so that they can feel comfortable trying something new.
Yeah, I know. All very good points. So just getting a little bit philosophical here then, as we sort of linger on that topic of wearing the technology, at some point we're talking about embedding the technology. And so we obviously know companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink and, other sorts of bio layers, and the idea of extending and expanding human consciousness, or really, if you will, the collective consciousness. Mm-hmm. I mean, is there a personal stance on that, a philosophy, or do you just try to stay away from topics like that and leave that to the philosophers?
I'll say this. It's going to be easier to get people to use a wearable than an implantable, probably. It may be the case that in the coming years, the trend moves more towards implantables. I don't know. I would never underestimate, people like Elon Musk, of course, in what they're doing. And for given populations, like the research I used to be doing, implantables make sense. So for people with Parkinson's, for years, we've used deep brain stimulation devices, which are implanted into the brain, and then a battery pack is buried underneath your skin, and it provides stimulation to your brain to reduce your symptoms. So this technology exists, and I think for specific populations, it makes sense. That trade-off is worth it. For a general population, getting an implantable right now is a pretty serious decision. So it would make sense that perhaps we trend towards that direction, but I wouldn't place any bets on it yet because it's not super clear. What is clear is that people are willing to use wearables, especially when you're using them for 5-10 minutes at a time. That's not so much a big deal. But I could see, if we kind of glimpse into the future, it might make sense that eventually we get to that point, but I'm not sure yet.
Right. No, it's all really great points. So one of the things, as you probably know, at Impetus Digital is we've built some best-in-class collaboration tools to allow pharma, medical device, or life science companies to have these courageous conversations with their customers, payers, patients. We really believe at Impetus that everything starts with a thought. And to be able to get truly creative and expansive and to progress as individuals, companies, societies, communities, we need to start a conversation. And so that's what we really are trying to do, is bridging the gap and being able to bridge the gap between, innovative thinkers and sort of digital therapeutics of the future with ways of people that have already built industries today, and bridging that gap and starting to have those conversations. So if people wanted to get in touch with you, what was the best way for them to learn more about BrainCo or about any of your team specifically?
Yeah, if you go to brainco.tech, so we're a technology company, so we're www.brainco.tech. And this idea just came to me in terms of what you guys are doing. I imagine it would be possible to use these types of devices to measure how engaged the participants are when they're doing your types of services. So you could probably prove scientifically that when people are engaging with your platform, that their brains are, maybe more engaged than in normal conversations or something like that. So even, directly with what you're doing, I think there's applications of this technology.
I love it. Actually, I'm going to probably take you up on that. I'm definitely going to think about that. I think it's very, very cool. Thank you very much for this. I just wanted to let you know that